Well, speaking of severe weather, you've no doubt seen cars with dimpled hoods and roofs from hail. Large hail can be dangerous and can damage property. Here's First Alert 6 meteorologist Jade Steffens with how those big hailstones form.
During severe weather, you may have heard meteorologists use the term hail core, which is a part of the storm producing the biggest hail. But how does this happen? Hail forms in thunderstorms with strong updrafts. An updraft is a rising, warm column of air that fuels the storm. This rising air carries raindrops up into cold areas of the atmosphere where they freeze. The frozen droplets grow when liquid water freezes onto the hailstone's surface, and additional layers of ice form each time it's swept up. If hail falls to the ground when its weight exceeds the force of the updraft, and the updraft can no longer support the weight of the hailstone. So the stronger the updraft, the more the hailstone is able to grow, and that produces bigger hail. Hailstones are highly reflective on the radar. The hail core usually shows up as the most intense part of the storm, which can also closely resemble heavy downpours. Radar can estimate hail size, but we rely on real person reports to confirm. If you can do so safely, we always appreciate when viewers send in photos of hail and share reports telling us the size of the hail and the location where it fell. That helps us confirm what radar is estimating and to communicate that information to the communities where the storm is headed next. And if a severe thunderstorm with large hail threat moves into your area, it's best to take cover immediately. If you have the option, move your car to cover and stay away from windows. Reporting in the studio, Jade Steffens, First Alert 6.